Gentle disclaimer to all of our listeners. All medical information mentioned in this podcast is purely informational. It is not individualized medical advice. Please follow up with your physician or medical practitioner for individualized care specific to your needs. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Know and Do Better podcast. My name is Dr. Melanie Carminati. And for those who have listened to our previous podcast about endometriosis and last month about pelvic pain, you are in for a treat. We have Shannon Cohn here. We will be speaking about endometriosis and social justice. Shannon Cohn is the director of Below the Belt. So Shannon, thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course. Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
So for those who do not know Shannon Cohn, as I mentioned, she is a documentary producer and director. Her work has been broadcast on PBS, Nat Geo, and Discovery Channel, among others. Before becoming a filmmaker, she practiced international law and was part of the legal team who prosecuted Enron. She has endometriosis and has 2 young daughters with a 7-time increased risk of having the disease. Before we get into the details about endometriosis and Below the Belt, I want to mention to all of our listeners, you may already be aware, but we are having a endometriosis fundraiser, an exclusive Below the Belt screening in Brooklyn, New York at Littlefield, NYC on Tuesday, March 21st. It will be from 7 to 9:30 p.m. And we will be having a post-screening physician panel discussion with 2 endometriosis surgeons and 2 pelvic pain physiatrists. There will be some fun stuff too. We'll have some raffles. So be sure to purchase your tickets. Again, this is an exclusive screening. You cannot see Below the Belt as of now on other streaming platforms. So you need to attend events like these to see the documentary. I have featured other endometriosis surgeons like Dr. Liu on this podcast, and we spoke about endometriosis. And then last month, I spoke to Dr. Ahmed of Pelvic Rehab Medicine, and we spoke about pelvic pain. So most of the listeners, you guys are already in the loop about endometriosis and this unique disease and how it affects millions of people with female sex organs around the world. So I want to just quickly say endometriosis. We know that it is a disease where endometrial-like tissue forms outside of the uterus in other different parts of the body. And some of the symptoms that people can have include pelvic abdominal pain, bloating, gastrointestinal issues, infertility, and many other symptoms and diagnoses. So, Shannon, since you have a personal journey with endometriosis, could you talk a little bit about that and tell us when you started experiencing symptoms and how long did it take until you received a diagnosis?
Yes, of course. All of the work that we're doing within endometriosis definitely comes from a personal place as someone who has endometriosis. And now, like you mentioned, I have 2 young daughters who have a 7 times increased risk of developing endometriosis. I first had symptoms when I was 16. I presented with GI symptoms first. And I think probably a lot of your listeners may or may not know that actually GI symptoms are incredibly common, initial symptoms of endometriosis. Upwards, I've seen some studies that say 80 to 90% of first symptoms of endo are actually GI symptoms. I presented that way and then developed painful periods that were debilitating and really interfered with my day-to-day life. I did not hear the word endometriosis until 13 years later when I was 29 years old. And a surgeon I was having surgery for an ovarian cyst, incidentally found endometriosis, and she didn't touch it. She didn't treat it, and just said offhandedly after, in the post-op, "Oh, by the way, you have endometriosis. Did you know that?" And I was like, "What?" And I went and I remember going home and Googling it. And of course I misspelled it because I had never heard of it and it sounded terrifying. And when I was reading about it, and online, it sounded terrifying because I've read all of the stats about how it affects fertility. And as a 29-year-old, I did, as part of my own personal wish for family planning, that I did want children. And that was really terrifying for me. So of course I go back to her with all these questions that really she wasn't prepared to answer. Like she's a really good obstetrician. Like she delivered my children, did an amazing job.
Yeah.
But like most OB-GYNs, she just wasn't well equipped to answer in-depth questions about endometriosis, nor was she well qualified to treat it.
Yeah. So I think your story, many listeners and people who have endometriosis can relate to, because that age, that time period, the idea of fertility or infertility related to a disease is kind of, it's scary. Why do you think it takes so long to receive a proper diagnosis?
I think that the true symptomatic profile isn't well taught and isn't well known. I think that especially frontline providers don't really know about endometriosis. It wasn't, emphasized in their medical education. First of all, they just didn't have that knowledge to know when a red flag should come up for endometriosis. Kip McKenzie in Boston, he's an endometriosis specialist, and he's like, the mind can't know what it doesn't know, or it can't see what it doesn't recognize, and
Yeah.
all of these philosophical ways to put it. But really, obviously, if you've never been taught about it, how can you actually recognize it?
Of
If you've never
course.
been taught it's prevalent, it seems like, a footnote in women's health. Why would you automatically think it? And, historically, it just hasn't been emphasized. It's been relegated, marginalized as an inconsequential women's health issue that's not that important, when in fact it affects 200 million people approximately worldwide
Yeah.
and has all these enormous burdens on society, like, up to 50% of infertility in women, 6 to 11 hours of lost productivity each week due to
Wow.
endometriosis
Wow.
symptoms, billions and billions of dollars of burden on society in the US each year, all around the world, but due to lost productivity, medical costs, all of the things that fiscally the disease puts on, the burden that it puts on people, individuals, and society as a whole. For a disease that affects the same amount of people, I was reminded of this stat last night that it affects the same amount of people that if they all formed their own country, it would be a bigger country. It'd be the eighth largest country in the world,
Huh.
bigger than Mexico, Russia, and Japan. When you look at it that way and you're like, why are people not recognizing it? It feels almost criminal.
Yeah. The personal detail that you mentioned regarding your OB-GYN, just mentioning it offhand, I know for the patients that I've treated at Inspira for pelvic floor physical therapy, and many times they come into me, and I might be the first one to mention the diagnosis and refer them out for further workup. They'll be like, but no, my OB-GYN, X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, okay. And sometimes even there's cases where I ask for like their last imaging, pelvic sauna or pelvic MRI. And there's even reports of some endometrioma being present. So it's an interesting thing. And I feel that in terms of the OB-GYN education, because of the prevalence that you mentioned, it affects so many people. It's something, an area for growth and improvement that could really change the lives of so many people and get them the care sooner that they need, and help in so many other ways with quality of life. So I know that when I was preparing for this discussion with you, in another interview recording that I saw with you with Emily Vogel of The Wrap, you mentioned how Below the Belt is different from your previous documentary, Endo What, which primarily was educational. And now Below the Belt is geared more towards highlighting social justice issues surrounding the diagnosis. And as the name implies, Below the Belt, it implies that unfair treatment. So, can you talk about the levels of social injustice your documentary Below the Belt highlights?
Of course, yes, thank you. Right from the start, we knew that we needed two films. First, an educational film that really was meant targeted to patients, to providers, to give an accurate base of knowledge. And that is what EndoWhat does. For Below the Belt, we knew that we wanted to make a film and tell a story of the disease and people highlighted who live with it, to bring the story to the mainstream and to bring it in a way that mainstream audiences are used to digesting films and accustomed to digesting stories and issues. One way to do that is to highlight, the social justice issues that this disease does raise. I say it's a perfect awful storm of so many things,
Mm,
like stigma and taboo, historically with menstrual health or women's health
Mhm.
conditions below the waist, below the belt, so to
Mhm.
speak, gender bias in medicine, racial bias in medicine, which compounds the issue, and informed consent. And what does that look like? Do you really know what the treatments or medications that you're being prescribed? Do you really understand the side effect profile and what they're doing?
Mm.
And beyond that, financial barriers to care.
Mm.
So really looking at a lot of these large systemic healthcare issues that apply to everyone, but
Yeah.
through the lens of a single condition like endometriosis, which is so pervasive and so devastating, but most people can't even pronounce it if they've ever even heard of it. So that's a social justice issue in itself. And that's why we decided to approach it that way.
Amazing. I think it's so important, and because I work with a lot of individuals, women, in pelvic floor physical therapy along the whole spectrum, pelvic pain, prenatal, postnatal, whatever it is, these experiences of
Mhm.
not really being heard come up a lot with these patients. I know for me, because of the way Inspira is set up, we see our patients for a full hour, so I get time just to talk to them and just to hear their story, and
Mhm.
sometimes be the first to give a little bit more education on a specific diagnosis or kind of translate what they may have received. Want to mention one particular individual that was featured in Below the Belt. I believe that she works as a nurse, and despite her professional knowledge, she was experienced being gaslit and just not taken seriously for the care that she was seeking. And from what I understand, she had to have her boyfriend come in to speak to the, excuse me, providers to get some kind of, I guess, proper response that she was hoping for. Is that?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think that's something a lot of women will probably identify with, no matter what the health condition is, or even going to the mechanic, for example.
Uh-huh.
I do that where I'm like, oh, I told my husband, I'm like, I think you're gonna have to go with me just to like be there, and it makes me grit my teeth, and it makes me so mad, but at the same time, I'm like, let's just be efficient. This is the way it is. I don't want to waste time. You know what I mean? Which is, I think, where Jenna was coming from. She was like, I'm sick of
Yeah.
this. I just want an answer. I want someone to take me seriously. I don't want to keep going back. So fine, just come. You know what I mean? But yeah, like she is a nurse. At the time, she was a nurse at UCLA. She was going to the ER and seeing doctors and wasn't being taken seriously. She could feel like she wasn't being believed. So she started taking her boyfriend, who was a computer programmer, appointments with her or to the ER with her because she found a marked difference that if he were there, they would listen to her more. And sometimes she would even let him speak for her on a health condition that was affecting her body. It's kind of outrageous. And exacerbating and this is that she happens to be an African American woman and
Mm.
her boyfriend at the time was a white man. So there's a lot of stuff at play there. And we decided to examine that. Like, what is this? There's a lot of things to unpack here, and none of them are
Mm.
good. So we need to shine a light on it and say, hey, this is happening.
Amazing. So important. So important. I want to shift gears into picking your brain about what do you think will help to correct some of the social injustices experienced by individuals who have endometriosis?
I mean, I think it's not just one thing. We have to change national discourse or international discourse around the disease, break the taboos talking about, menstruation, periods,
Yeah.
endometriosis, and related conditions that historically have been, wrapped in like silence basically or whispered about. That needs to change, and it is changing. Like, with my daughters, for example, they talk about their periods with their friends pretty regularly
Yeah.
and openly,
Yeah.
much more than I did with my friends. Like, we
Right.
would laugh about it a little bit, but we didn't really talk about it, and
Right.
they just talk about it like normal, and it makes me so happy
Yeah.
because I see it changing. That's a huge thing. It all starts with awareness. It all starts with shining a light on the issues so that people understand these are issues. These are what these are the things that are holding back progress. And when people understand and are aware of them, then we can all start working to change, which is exactly why we decided to make films so that we can increase that widespread awareness.
Amazing. I know too from last month's podcast, Dr. Ahmed actually filled me in more about the Rose study that's happening at Northwell or Fine C Northwell Health. And this study she was super excited about. I was excited to learn about it from her, how they're doing the studies to find the genetic markers, the suspected genetic markers related to endometriosis by collecting the menstrual tissue and analyzing it. And I think just that possibility of finding a pattern, a genetic pattern, and then being able to, assess it without having to go in laparoscopically, the kinds of changes that that could possibly have.
I mean, it all starts there. Like it all starts in finding what causes it, finding what happens in that genetic process that some people develop endometriosis and others don't. So when we have those answers, we can be better equipped to then answer all of the other questions that, surround the disease.
Exactly. I know that Below the Belt is actually going to be airing as well on PBS on Wednesday, March 29th.
It's actually, the date has changed.
Oh, tell me when.
No, it's going to actually be June 21st now.
June 21st.
So,
right.
It's just going to be a little bit later, but it is coming. It's down, it's
Great.
coming down the pipe, but it'll be June 21st.
Okay, June 21st. So what's your vision for the impact of Below the Belt reaching such a large amount of viewers? And what are your hopes with reaching many people with the documentary?
It's not just one thing, I hope. I mean, I hope a lot of things. I hope people who are well situated feel galvanized or feel inspired to use whatever talents, skills, experiences that they have to move the needle toward a little bit further toward progress. And I always tell people, they're like, what can I do? I'm like, think practically. What do you do in your life that you can do, that you can change? And you can change maybe one person's life, or you can change more than that. Like, what's your unique skill set? I mean, that's why I decided to make films, because I'm a filmmaker and I'm a lawyer. So I like looking at issues through a social justice lens. I hope that everybody who watches it, first of all, knows now there is something called endometriosis.
Right.
And second, that it has a real human impact on the people who have it and the people who love them. That's what I hope. I hope that, for example, someone named, I was saying your Uncle Joe, everybody's got an Uncle Joe who lives in a place like Iowa, for example, and never heard of endometriosis and never cared about endometriosis, but he happens to be watching PBS that night and says, oh, well, this is an interesting film or a good story. And then it's over and that's fine. Uncle Joe goes about his own life, but then he does know about endometriosis. Exactly. And you never know, one day he may be situated when his daughter or granddaughter or friend's daughter is having symptoms and he can say, hey, have you heard about endometriosis? I mean, the ripple effect potential is enormous. And that's why we wanted to get it on this type of platform.
Yeah, I think it's going to be incredible. For myself, with running our fundraiser and Below the Belt screening, my hope was for all of Park Slope, Brooklyn, and all of Brooklyn to know, if we were to go out on the street and just say, do you know what endometriosis is? That they would be able to give an informed response.
I love that. Yeah.
Starting in the communities is what I'm trying to do, starting in the local community.
We did that. Yeah, actually, it's a funny story. We did that on a couple of college campuses recently. And we were just like, what is endometriosis? And we were just, in the quad, just asking whoever walked by. And I laughed so hard. This one guy was so earnest, but he said, that's the type of dinosaur. And I couldn't stop laughing. He's like, right? right? And I was like,
Oh,
no, but that's amazing. This is the best answer I've ever heard.
wow.
So, yeah, that just kind of shows you where we are, yeah, in the mainstream. So it's a low bar to start on. So let's see if we can build on it for sure.
Totally.
Um,
I don't know. You are the first filmmaker that I've actually met with on this podcast. So I don't know what your artistic process is like. Are you already making another documentary? What's the process? What's the plan next?
well, these films were 10 years in the making. They were
Okay.
really passion projects. We, of course, worked on other things and worked on these as we could, but they were really, a labor of love. And I'm a filmmaker, but I'm also a social movement builder, and
Uh-huh.
that I'm really trying to use the films as catalyzing tools for systematic, tangible change.
Right.
And a lot of our time right now is working on that, like screening the film at medical schools, speaking at medical schools. I
Mhm.
helped teach a class at Harvard Medical School a few weeks ago in bioethics, and we screened the film and talked about some of the issues we mentioned
Wow.
earlier. Next week, we're screening at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, which is the largest OB-GYN residency program in the country.
Oh, wow.
So we're using
Congratulations.
the film as an educational tool for medical education. Last night, I actually did a webinar. We did a virtual screening of the film, and I did a webinar for the Illinois Association of School Nurses.
Okay.
So the state school nurse association, and we screened the film and had a really great dynamic discussion about the issues, particularly facing school nurses with recognizing symptoms of endometriosis. Doing that on a number of with different types of providers and a number of different levels. Beyond that, we're doing university screenings. We have two big university screenings, for example, scheduled at big state schools in March as kind of the first pilot events. Beyond that, we have our school nurse initiative where we've educated over 5,000 school nurses already about endometriosis, and we hope to get to 15,000 in the next 2 years. The answer is I'm not just a filmmaker, and that's not the only thing. We're doing intentional, meaningful films and then building social impact campaigns around them. So it takes a lot of time and effort.
Sure.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure, and I am thinking about, okay, what is going to be the next film? I haven't started filming yet, but I have a few ideas in mind, and they will be within the women's health space, this health space, because now I'm so intimately acquainted with all of the injustices and all of the issues going around that all deserve their own film, you know?
Totally.
So it's like just choosing, okay, you know what? We're going to start pulling that thread and see where it leads. So stay tuned.
I sure will. I can't wait to see. I can't wait to see what happens next. That's really incredible that you are going directly to the OB-GYN programs and presenting there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing.
I mean, and I was when we screened at Harvard a few weeks ago, just first year medical students, and that's the first time I had actually screened to medical students
I see.
themselves. And I was kind of like I didn't really know what the reaction would be.
Uh-huh.
And I was so heartened and excited to know they were all like properly outraged that this was happening.
Mhm.
It touched their hearts. It touched their hearts
Mhm.
in a way that I know they won't forget it. That's
Yeah.
the most important thing. Like they can look at the bullet points in medical school. They can, look at all the textbooks. We've shown them true lived experience of people around a disease. I know they won't forget endometriosis. And no matter what specialty they end up going into, they'll all and I told them, I was like, it
Yeah.
doesn't matter if you go into GYN or not, like whatever your specialty, you will at some point in your career come across someone who has endometriosis. Are you going to be the person who notices it? Kind of giving them that challenge. But I mean, they were super impressive. I think they're up for the challenge.
Incredible. Well, Shannon, thank you so much for your time. Do you have any final words of hope and wisdom for the listeners?
Yeah, of course I do. I mean, the film Below the Belt, I wanted to end it, for example, on a hopeful note because we all do have hope. This is a hard disease to navigate for
Mhm.
providers and patients.
Mhm.
But none of us are only one thing, right? We're not just an endometriosis patient. We're not just a physical therapist. Like we
Mhm.
all have hopes, we have dreams, we have loves, and we are loved. And, it was really important to me that the film captured the humanity that, we all have.
Yeah.
And I do think there's hope with this disease. There are a lot of people, a lot lot of really good people doing what they can to create progress and to create change. So I would say take heart in that and do your part. And there are answers. You don't have to live a life in pain. And if you're being dismissed, or the medication you're taking is not working, or your needs aren't being met, know that you can find answers. You can find providers who are equipped to help you with this disease. I've been on both sides, and thank goodness I'm on the other side. But just a note there of encouragement.
Thank you for that message of support and encouragement. It's important to remember. So, Shannon, thank you again for your time. For our listeners, if you have not done so already, please go to Inspira Physical Therapy and Pilates Eventbrite link. We have it in our bio. Purchase your ticket for the endometriosis fundraiser and exclusive Below the Belt documentary screening. It is surely something you do not want to miss. Tickets will not be sold at the door. Until next time, everyone stay tuned for another informative, educational, and light-shedding conversation on the Know and Do Better podcast. Thank you.